G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program with Mags. Now, I have had a slight issue with my Kerbal Space Program career that I just started. Basically, I've had to restart the entire career from scratch. Now, let me show you why. So, I really wish I could have got video recording of this particular bug for you. Unfortunately, every time I tried to record it, it crashed both Kerbal Space Program and my recording software. Basically what seems to happen with this bug is the second the physics activate upon setting a rocket up on the launch pad ready to deploy it, it goes into an effect like Reentry, as you can see, and the crew cabin immediately explodes, killing the Kerbals that are inside of it, but as you can see, leaving the parachute where it would normally sit on top of the crew capsule. If you end this flight, which you have no choice, the crew's dead and it won't launch, recover the rocket and deploy another rocket, even a rocket of a different design, and exactly the same effect will happen again. This bug is currently responsible for killing all of my Kerbals in the career mode trying to fix it, and after a while I did find a forum post on this particular bug and a very easy way of correcting it. All you've got to do to fix this bug is, when it shows up, revert to hangar and then relaunch your rocket and everything will be perfectly fine. However, in hard mode Kerbal Career, you don't have a revert button, so it destroys your save game. In a way, I'm almost thankful that this particular bug popped up when it did, because if this had happened halfway through my career, it would have been devastating to my entire series. Now, what I've done instead is I've started a new save. I've used my original video that I posted a week ago as a guideline and recreated every single step that I did during the course of that video to get my career back up to where it was. So everything that happened in that video has happened again in this career mode. The only changes that I've made is, instead of being a hard mode career, it's now a custom career. All the settings are still set to hard mode, however I've activated revert to hangar and quick save on this save game. Now with a little bit of luck, I'll never have to use them. I have no problem losing Kerbals or screwing up a mission. That's part of the fun of Kerbal Space Program, having things go wrong and then trying to either account for them, trying to rescue the situation, or planning an entirely new mission to try and rescue the Kerbals that have just gotten stuck due to something that went wrong over the course of the mission. What I do have a problem with is bugs that are completely outside of anything's control within Kerbal, breaking the game. And really that's what I intend to use these features for if absolutely necessary to do so. Besides that, if something goes wrong in the game that's my fault from bad piloting or bad designing or anything along those lines, bad shit will happen and I will deal with it as is appropriate within the game. Anyways, so, as I said before, I've reset this career using the video as a guide to make sure I'm exactly where I was beforehand. I may have been slightly too efficient on my rocket launches, so I've wound up a little bit better on the money side, but really that's the only change that's happened. I'm in exactly the same position that I was at in the tech tree, with pretty much the same amount of science that I had available after the last mission. So, let's go back to Kerbal Space Center and take a closer look at the Mun. So, I'm going to time compress today's rocket build because, honestly, this took about 20 minutes to put together on its own. The reason why is because I sort of over-engineered this one a little bit. This rocket that I'm building is not just going to be the rocket that takes me from my Mun Flyby, which is today's mission objective. We're going to see if we can get a good close look at the Mun, pick up all the high-altitude Kerbal space science, the high-altitude Mun science, and then bring our rocket back. But I also want to use this rocket as a prototype for the rocket that is going to do the Mun landing, which I'm hoping will be the very next mission. So, travelling to the Mun, what do you actually need? Well, in traditional aerodynamics for Kerbal Space Program, you need about 4,500 delta V just to make it to space and achieve an orbit. Now, because I'm running Ferram Aerospace, the atmosphere is a little bit thinner, it's a little bit slipperier to be able to pass through. You can probably get around with about 3,500 delta V for this initial part of the transit. You're then looking at about 1,000 meters per second of delta V in order to be able to make the transit to the Mun. You're looking at an additional 600 odd to make the landing, another 600 for takeoff, and then you're looking at about 860 for the return. That will get you back to the planetary atmosphere. You obviously do not need any fuel for the landing itself because you'll be using the atmosphere itself to aero brake and parachutes in order to land. So overall, in the end, in a far atmosphere, you're looking at around about 6,500 to 6,700 delta V overall on launch in order to be able to get there and back. And that's allowing for extra fuel for a safety margin. So if something goes wrong, you can overburn a little bit if you absolutely need to. So obviously most of your delta V consumption is going to be in that initial launch period, getting yourself into space and into orbit. This is where your SRBs come in. They're incredibly cheap, they're extremely powerful, and they're very disposable. So whack a couple of SRBs on, this will get you your initial Delta V push to get you out of the atmosphere. I generally like to set my rockets up, especially this early in the game. My main stage will be liquid fuel with anywhere between 3 to 4 solid fuel rocket boosters depending on the weight and mass of my rocket. Now I want the center stage to be liquid fueled because I need control when I get it into orbit. I'm actually going to use the center launch stage in order to achieve orbit and do the initial part of my transit burn. Now in comparison to my last rocket, you'll notice this time that my command capsule is actually the final stage on its own. It's not taking the science experiments with it. That's because I was building this rocket with intention just to find out exactly how much it would cost to construct. Then I was planning on going out and upgrading my astronaut complex. This allows me to go EVA, so the plan here is I'm going to go through, pick up the science from the flyby, then I'm going to actually EVA my Kerbal out, pull all the science out of the experiments and stick it in the pod, jump in the pod, and then I don't have to worry about the balancing act of trying to keep the landing component of the rocket, the final stage, upright during atmospheric reentry and risking it tipping and exploding. Now the final parts of this build here, I ran into two small issues. First is the part restriction on the vehicle assembly building. Without upgrades, the vehicle assembly building can only build rockets consisting of 30 components, and that last build was on 32, so I had to lose a couple of components in order to make this work. I then had to shrink the size of my rocket by reducing the size of the liquid fuel stage because it was also too tall. The vehicle assembly building actually has size restrictions on how big you can build your rocket until it's upgraded. This initial rocket turned out to be about 2.5 meters too tall, and without losing science experiments, the only place that I could really afford to pull the size out was reducing the size of the liquid fuel booster in order to be able to make that size gap. The final modifications I had to make were, well, it wasn't actually a modification. I had to go outside and upgrade the landing pad as well, because the landing pad will only support rockets up to a certain weight, and this was quite a bit over that maximum weight. So the landing pad itself is actually not an incredibly expensive upgrade that needs to be done, and it was one that I was going to have to do anyway, but it was still one that I had to take care of. So 20 odd minutes of rocket building in order to assemble this, around 250,000 credits in order to upgrade the facilities at Kerbal Space Center in order to be able to utilise this rocket, and at least 3 redesigns in the long run, and I finally have a working prototype. So let's take this thing out to the launch pad and see if it flies. Okay, so today's launch is going to be a night launch. Now, normally I wouldn't do these because it's going to be incredibly hard to see exactly what's going on once I get this thing up to altitude, but I installed on a new mod and I want to see how it looks, so let's check this out. Oh, that looks nice. Now for those curious about this, the modification is called engine lighting. It's available on Kerbal stuff. Basically it creates a light that throws ambient light around your rocket based on the strength of your engines at the point of the engine exhaust. So the more powerful an engine you have, the more light it will throw out into the environment. Actually, I wonder if I build a rocket that has a massive pile of nuclear engines, if I fired it on the dark side of the moon, whether or not I'd be able to light it up. I might have to do that as a challenge later. Anyways, ascent here is pretty standard. I'm going at about 10 degrees over at the moment, slowly trying to increase to 45 approximate. As soon as the boosters flame out, I'm going to jettison them. Now, if you look down at the left-hand side of the nav ball, you'll notice my thrust settings are only at slightly above 1/3 of maximum. This is because I'm trying not to burn too much of the liquid fuel in the primary engine stage, because that is also going to be my Lunar injection stage. If I've done this right, the boosters and 1/3 throttle should get me into space, circularize and begin injection with the main stage, and then I'll have all the fuel that I need to make it there and back. SRB, flame out and jettison, and oh no, that's not good. That's not good. Shut down the engines. Sure. 37,000. 39, still climbing, and it doesn't look like the rocket has split apart. I'm not entirely sure what just happened then. The second the SRBs jettisoned, they were fine while they were still attached, but as soon as they jettisoned, the rocket immediately turned 90 degrees sideways, and it now looks like it's oscillating back and forth. It looks like the center of mass of the rocket has thrown itself off. It could be that I didn't burn enough fuel running the throttle settings so low. The second the weight of the SRBs jettisoned, they must have been acting sort of like guidance fins and were keeping the rocket on flight, and then it rotated around the center of mass. Well, that was most certainly interesting. It looks like we're going to have to go for a total redesign of the rocket, which is... well, I'm glad it happened on this mission. Oh, I might be able to make this rocket work, but I won't be able to detach the SRBs until the rocket is already out of the atmosphere. Regardless, I seem to have an intact rocket in space at the moment. I really need to start getting this thing swung around, and ooh, it's heavy. It's very, very, very heavy. Right now this thing is relying entirely on the reaction control wheels, the SAS system, in order to be able to guide itself around, and it's basically the full length of the rocket still fully loaded with fuel, so it's just the SRS available in the command pod is not enough. Yeah, it looks like everything's intact, even the guidance fins didn't break off. Oh, well, if I use this for the Mun landing mission, I'll just have to keep the SRBs on. It looked like the SRBs had enough that with 1/3 throttle, it pushed this thing out past 100 kilometers anyway, for suborbital. So, I'll just have to keep the SRBs on until we break atmosphere, then jettison them, and that should prevent the side slip. And still leave me with a large fuel load to be able to circularize and inject to the Mun. Speaking of injections... now, the injection burn for this particular rocket is actually going to be a fairly long one, because it is a fairly large, heavy, fuel-loaded rocket here that I have to move. If you look down the bottom left-hand corner of the screen where Kerbal Engineer is set up, just next to the nav ball, you'll see I have my apoapsis and my periapsis height on display, and time too, both of these positions. So we're only around 21 seconds out of apoapsis at the moment. Apoapsis being, of course, the highest position in the orbit. Periapsis is the lowest point, and right now it's at negative 460, give or take, which puts the lowest point of my orbit about 360 kilometers below the surface of Kerbal. So I really need to make that one higher, and that's the number I'm watching here. Burning for orbit is quite simple, of course. Just align the rocket on the nav ball down the center of your prograde vector and burn until your periapsis is out in space. Preferably, well, you want over 70 kilometers, but I'm going to be aiming for around 100 kilometers. Now, if you're looking at the nav ball there a second ago, you would have noticed that I was slightly to the left of center on the prograde vector on the nav ball. This is because I'm only 21 seconds out of hitting apoapsis, and I want to try and increase that out just a little bit and give me a little bit more space. Now, the longer I burn for, the faster the orbit is going to grow. As you can see here, it's actually accelerating very quickly. This is because gravity is starting to assist my burn. And it looks like we're just about done with the burn. We're now gaining altitude, 70... Alright, 82, that's got us in space. Now I just want to give it a little bit more and try and push this out to 100. 92. Yeah, 92 will do. Actually, no, I'm going to give it a little bit more here. I'm just going to do a short burn. Yep, that'll do. 97 under 198. Okay, so what actually happened then is as I was completing that burn, as my orbit began to break out of the atmosphere and actually turn into an orbit, the positions of the apoapsis and the periapsis actually began to rotate on the orbit itself. They were trying to swap positions. Now, due to the fact that when they shifted, they turned almost 90 degrees to my location on the orbit, I was no longer burning on apoapsis or periapsis, the 2 points that are most efficient to burn on. So I was throwing off the orbit, which is why I've now got an orbit where I've managed to get my lowest point out to 100 kilometers, but in doing so I've punched my highest point out to 200. And finally, a little sunshine. Now, that burn did consume almost all of the fuel in my injection stage. Now, I think I'll do a little bit of EVA work here and just have a look around outside. I can pick up some science, EVA science from orbit around Kerbal now, because I've never been able to do this before. This is why I had to throw a little bit of money at upgrading the recruitment center, so I could actually go EVA. Now, as I was saying, I've consumed most of the fuel in my injection stage, but not all of it. So what I'm going to do is fire the last set of the injection stage to get me going on my way to the Mun. I'm then just going to jettison it and switch over to my primary engine stage, which has my extremely good quality, extremely efficient vacuum engine on board with the final fuel tank. Dropping that off, get rid of the excess weight from that final rocket stage should also make the rocket far more controllable. Now, of course, the downside of doing that means that that large engine stage down the end with its wings attached, or its guidance fins attached, is going to be floating around in Kerbal equatorial orbit. So I'm going to have to deal with that at some stage in the future, but I'm not going to worry about it now. Actually, could be good practice for asteroid capture in the future. Anyways, I'll bring Jeb back inside. There's not much for him to... Jeb, grab onto the ladder. So I'll just activate the RCS to get him back under control, or activate his jetpack at least. Get him back in so we can get him grab on again. There we go. Now, board, there, B. Thank you. Now, there is a reason why I keep sending Jeb on these missions and not Val at the moment, and that's because I'm trying to get enough XP on him to get him to level up the first time. So I have access to the prograde and retrograde pilot options, but you'll see why in probably the next episode. It's going to make the Mun landing a lot easier. Anyways, we better get this big bastard turned around and pointed in the right direction so we can get ready of our burn so we can intercept the Mun and make our flyby. Now this move here is not going to line us up. What I'm actually going to do here, we're going to eyeball the Mun. Because I haven't upgraded my tracking station yet, I don't have access to patch conics and maneuver nodes. So what I'm going to do is we're going to line up down the prograde vector at the moment, and then we're going to go through to map view. And what we do to get to the Mun is we're going to bring the moon around till it's just coming up over the horizon of Kerbal. And when we start seeing the Mun, we're going to burn straight down our prograde vector. If we time it right, we should get a nice smooth encounter. So once again, using time compression to speed things up. Now, just keeping myself lined up on the prograde vector until I jump over to the map view. Line the pod up with the icon for the moon, and sure enough, that'll bring the moon over the horizon. Make sure you're aligned down your prograde, and start the burn. So, as I said earlier, our orbital injection stage is not going to have enough fuel in order to be able to complete this transfer to the Mun. So we're just going to wait till it burns out, jettison it, then flick over to map view to finalise this burn under our final stage. And there she goes, engine flame out, jettison, fire next stage. And I honestly have no idea what it is, but there's something I really enjoy about watching detached booster stages just fall away as you're continuing a burn. Anyways, no matter, let's flick over to map view and finalise this encounter. And as you can see, we've increased the orbit to about halfway to the Mun. It won't actually take a whole lot longer. We're just going to continue the burn for a little bit more and wait till the Apophis crosses the orbit for the Mun and shut down the engines. That's it. We're done. Now, if all has gone to plan, we should shoot out from Kerbal, encounter the Mun, have a nice smooth flyby and begin our fall all the way back to Kerbal without ever once having to fire the engine. And once again, back into time compression to cut down on the travel time here. Now, I did jump Jebediah out a couple of times to grab some near Kerbal science that popped up as available as we were going through, and some near space science, but nothing too major. Take what I can get while I can get it, because I'm bloody well going to need it later. As we watch Kerbal fall away, we're very, very rapidly approaching the point where I'm going to flick out of time compression so you can see the Mun encounter. So, back out of time compression, and there it is. So, for anyone watching who has been having trouble getting to the Mun so far, there it is in career mode. No maneuver nodes, nothing. Now, unfortunately, this hasn't been a perfect transfer. As you can see, the orbit actually cuts below the surface of the Mun at its lowest point, so I am going to smash into the surface of the Mun at an ungodly velocity unless I make a slight adjustment, which is what I'm doing now. It's actually quite easy to correct. Just line your ship up down the prograde vector, give it a couple of seconds of burn on your approach to the Mun, and that's it. So once again, back into time acceleration. I'm not going to bore you with the entire Minmus flyby itself, the actual close portion of it. I ended up having to shoot around the back of the dark side of the Mun. That was just the way the encounter happened, so you're really not going to get to see a whole lot as we make the flyby. Don't worry, in the next video you're going to get a much closer look at the surface itself. So of course, as I shot through the flyby, I just quickly jumped Jeb out a couple of times, grabbed what science I could as we made the pass. I was trying to do most of the science transfer before we hit the dark side proper, because even seeing the science experiments is a pain in the ass. And of course, I transferred all of the science from the experiment modules mounted on the main drive section over to the crew capsule, so the ship is now actually ready for re-entry. I can jettison the engine section away, and all the science is safe and secured with Jeb. That's another thing I like in Kerbal Space Program. Watching Kerbal rise over the Mun, or any planet rise over any other planet, it gives you a really sort of an epic feeling. What must it have been like, being an astronaut on one of the early Apollo missions, before the moon landing even, coming around from your orbit from the dark side of the moon, and watching the Earth come up over the horizon. Sadly, while I can't vouch for everybody, KSP is probably as close as I'm ever going to get to experiencing that, so... And once again, we're back to compressing time until the next burn. It might seem like I'm using quite a lot of time compression to get through this, but unfortunately this is the nature of early Mun missions. You only can carry enough science to do a certain number of experiments, and you usually knock them over as soon as you possibly can. Once they're done, it's just ride the rocket until you get it back home. And all things going to plan, this burn will be the last mission critical burn that I have to perform. I've just exited the Mun sphere of influence, I've dropped into Kerbin's sphere of influence, I'm at the highest point that I will be in a Kerbin orbit. Well, short of doing one full orbit back to Apophis, that is. Now this last burn did only drop my periapsis to 107 kilometers, and this is too high, this is going to skip over the top of the atmosphere. What I've chosen to do at this point, due to having a large amount of Delta V left over after my flyby, is to actually do a suicide burn into the atmosphere. This is not the most efficient way to enter the atmosphere, but I can potentially drop a lot of my orbital velocity doing a last second burn at the periapsis. This is because at the periapsis you'll be at the highest orbital velocity that you'll be at any other point in your orbit, with your Apophis always being the lowest point due to being the highest part. At this point, it's my thrust directly versing my orbital velocity. You can see how quickly I'm dropping my Apophis down doing this burn. Now with over half a tank of fuel still remaining, I've got more than enough Delta V to drag this Apophis right down into a re-entry vector. Now, the only thing I'm concerned about at the moment is looking at the map. It looks like I'm going to come down on the dark side. I took off on the dark side, I made the flyby in the Mun on the dark side, I don't want to land on the dark side as well, so I'm actually going to just slightly adjust the angle on this burn, and just keep burning until I've got a light side entry at this point. I've got more than enough fuel to be able to almost kill all my orbital velocity at this point. Highest point in the orbit is now only 300 kilometers and rapidly falling, 250 kilometers, 200, 170, and there we go, apoapsis and periapsis swap places, and I have a periapsis of only 185 meters. And there we go, my orbit has now become my re-entry corridor. Unfortunately, as I was worried, the periapsis is on the dark side of the planet, and I am not going to land on the dark side, so I'm just going to take a bit of a look here. So what I'm going to have to do is wait for a minute here. Because my apoapsis and periapsis swap places during my descent, I'm now actually climbing back away from the planet. I have to wait, it's going to take about 4 minutes to hit apoapsis, and then I'll start descending again. At that point I can set myself up for another burn that'll drag my descent corridor right around to the light side of the planet. So once again I hit that time compression button because there's nothing really to do at this point except hurry up and wait. We can't actually align to complete the next part of our burn and final re-entry into the planet until we've passed apoaps, which we're just about to do now under time acceleration. Now I did notice last minute, thanks to my little science warning, there was some science to grab on the way up as we passed over one of the, I believe it was the mountain ranges. I got the mountain ranges over space science there, so every little bit extra helps. And there was also one very short 5-second burn in there, and I was just realigning my re-entry corridor. I was going to see if I can bring my command pod down on an island that's just off the coast here. Unfortunately I was moving slightly too fast and I was never going to be able to get it. So back to real time and getting ready for our final descent burns. Just aligning the rocket now, making sure we're down the retrograde vector. Start the burn, and this time I just emptied fuel tanks. There's nothing else left to do at this point. And this is just to drop us sharply into the ocean, give us a good, slow re-entry that's not going to bother the heat shields too much. All the science is transferred into the pod. This is just the finishing touches on a pretty good, pretty successful little mission at this point. I'm pretty happy with it. A successful Mun landing and a load of science taken back, as well as a minimus flyby and landing, and I should have all the science I need to actually start assembling some space stations in orbit and start looking at putting together some rockets that are going to move materials to either the Mun or Minmus for the establishment of my first colony. So with the fuel in the final stage burned out, quick jettison and let it fall away, make sure we're aligned on the retrograde vector so we have the heat shield pointing forward. just give it a quick right click. I like to have the ablator up so I can actually see how much is left in the heat shield. I know it really doesn't make a difference at this point, but I like to know when things are going to go horribly wrong just before they go horribly wrong, even if there's nothing I can do about it. Just over 30 kilometers inside of the atmosphere, I'm sitting just above the thick part, so the fun will begin in just a few moments. There's 29, still descending, 28, 27, and there's the thermal shock wave starting. Reentry heating is actually not really a lot at the moment. It looks like our suicide burn actually did the trick just nicely. It's only just started digging into the ablator now, and we're already down to 15 kilometers. We got 13. Yeah, that's it. We're decelerating. Our flux only hit about 370 there. I'm going to have to start coming into the atmosphere a little bit harder, because that was... I could have survived re-entry with nothing but bubble wrap. Still, I suppose a gentle re-entry is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when you're coming back with a very important load of science, and recovering the pod and completing the mission objectives of this one is going to get you enough money to be able to fund the next part of your space program. So, yeah, really need to not complain. Pop the chutes at just over 3 kilometers, and that's really it. Turn off SAS and swing down till we hit the water. This part is easily the most relaxing and most boring of the return in any mission. Because I'm running so many mods that increase realism and difficulty level, the descent is incredibly slow. And the worst part is you can't really time accelerate it in-game. You only have one time accelerator option when you're going through this sort of a descent, and it's not by much. The descent is usually the point where I go into the kitchen and make myself a pot of coffee. And splashdown. Pod is there, and I'm not going to mess around with it this time. We're just going to hit the recovery button, we're going to drag this thing straight back and check out the results of the mission. Which were not bad overall. 149.2 science for the entire mission. That brought me back in at 213. This is more than enough to unlock the bits and pieces that I want. Parts recovery, on the other hand, wasn't so great. Well, since I only bought back just the command pod, most of that was a loss, but I did get the 3 XP I needed to advance Jeb to level 1, which is something else I needed as well. And to finish off this video, we'll flick over to the research facility and work out what we're going to get next. Now, I did spend about 20 minutes in here going over the different tech nodes, working out the best combination to get for the amount of science I had, considering that I am dead set on landing on the Mun next. In the end, I ended up choosing the nodes Flight Control, Landing, and Basic Science. Basic Science gave me the few extra science experiments, as well as unlocking the access to the next set of electronics nodes, which will come with basically with solar panels, so I can start building satellites. Flight control is self-explanatory. I needed better control. That rocket instability at the start of the last launch, I cannot have that happen again. That could have potentially ended my mission there and there. And if I'm going to land, I probably want access to some landing legs, which is why landing. So, after a lot of dicking around, my space program is finally back on track, and as is the series for it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. May all your orbits be stable, and I'll catch you in the skies.